There is a man sitting at a cafe in Vienna. It is 1987, the height of the Cold War. The city is quietly divided between two worlds, one that smiles in the daylight and one that operates in the dark. The man orders a black coffee. He does not open a newspaper. He does not check his watch. He simply sits. He stirs his cup twice, then sets the spoon on the left side of the saucer. 3 minutes later, a woman in a gray coat walks past without looking at him. She does not sit down. She does not speak. But she registers the spoon, the direction it is pointing, the side it is resting on. And within the hour, a decision has been made. A decision that will change the trajectory of a covert operation. No words were exchanged. No documents passed hands. And yet, communication happened. Clean, precise, and invisible. This is what we are going to explore today. The science and art of communication that hides inside the ordinary. The language that exists inside normal behavior. The messages that travel through the texture of everyday life. If you find this research valuable, please like this video and subscribe. Share it with someone who thinks they understand the world. Every civilization has had a version of this. The ancient Greeks used a technique called steganography, hiding messages in plain sight. A slave's shaved head was tattooed with a military message. Then his hair was allowed to grow back before he was sent. The message arrived not as a coded cipher, but as flesh and bone and hair, indistinguishable from any other person. The carrier was the concealment. The ordinary was the disguise. This principle, that the best hiding place is not a locked vault, but an open field, is at the very foundation of how intelligence operatives have communicated for centuries. It is not about creating something complex and impenetrable. It is about creating something so normal, so utterly unremarkable, that the mind of an observer simply skips over it. Human perception is not designed to analyze everything it sees. It is designed to categorize, simplify, and move on. Good hidden communication exploits exactly that. And this is where we have to understand something important about how intelligence operatives think. They are not trying to outsmart the enemy's technology. They are trying to outsmart the enemy's attention. These are completely different problems. Technology can be improved, upgraded, broken, and rebuilt. But human attention, human perception, has a fixed set of weaknesses that have not changed in thousands of years. We look for the unusual, we ignore the usual. We notice what breaks patterns, and we filter out what confirms them. An operative who understands this is not working against technology. He is working with human nature itself. Let us talk about what is known in intelligence circles as layered communication. On the surface, two people are having a completely normal conversation. They might be discussing the weather, or a film they saw last week, or the rising price of bread. To anyone listening, and in certain environments, someone is always listening. The conversation is completely harmless. But underneath that conversation, a second conversation is happening simultaneously. The words themselves are not the message. The selection of words, the pattern of topics, the sequence in which things are mentioned. That is where the real communication lives. Think of it this way. Imagine two colleagues who have agreed that whenever one of them brings up a particular film director during a conversation, it signals that a meeting needs to happen urgently. They do not say, "We need to meet." They do not send a coded message. One of them simply says, during an otherwise normal discussion, "I was thinking about that Antonioni film the other day, the one with the long silences." That is it. That is the entire signal. The other person hears the name and understands. Everything that follows, the laughter, the agreement, the apparently spontaneous suggestion to grab lunch, is performance. The real message was already delivered. This kind of layered communication is remarkably difficult to detect because it requires the observer to know not just what is being said, but what is meaningful within a specific shared context. Without that context, the conversation is simply a conversation. With it, it is a transmission. Context is everything in hidden communication. This is not a metaphor. It is a technical reality. Two people can use the exact same words and mean completely different things depending on what framework of meaning they have agreed upon in advance. Intelligence handlers spend enormous effort establishing these frameworks, what is called in tradecraft a legend or a shared reference system, precisely because once the framework exists, communication can be almost completely open and almost completely invisible at the same time. There is a well-documented category of this called the one-time code. Before separation, two operatives agree on a reference they both know, a book, a song, a film. Then, when one of them needs to communicate, they send a message that on its face relates to that reference. Page 43 was my favorite part, says one, and the other knows, 43. That could mean a location number on a pre-agreed map grid, or a date, or a status code. The message is delivered in a sentence that would bore any eavesdropper into inattention. The genius of this approach is that it does not require encryption because it does not look like it requires encryption. Encryption draws attention. It says to anyone watching, something is being hidden here. Layered context-based communication says nothing of the sort. It says two people are having a perfectly forgettable conversation, and that is the entire point. Now let us move into something that most people never consciously notice, but that experienced. Observers read constantly behavioral communication. This is the transmission of information not through words at all, but through actions, choices, and movements that form patterns. And when those patterns deviate from the established baseline in specific ways, the deviation itself is the message. Consider a shop owner in a city where a resistance network is operating during an occupation. Every morning, he opens his shop at 8 o'clock and puts a display of fruit in the window. When the arrangement of the fruit is normal, apples in front, oranges behind, the network knows that the area is clear, that movement is safe, that the day's operations can proceed. The morning that the arrangement changes, oranges move forward. Or one apple placed separately, the entire network knows that something has changed. Perhaps there are increased patrols. Perhaps someone has been arrested. Perhaps it is time to suspend all activity. The shop owner has communicated a critical operational message to perhaps a dozen people who walked past his window that morning. He never spoke to any of them. He never wrote anything down. He simply arranged his fruit in a slightly different way, as any shopkeeper might do on any day, for any number of perfectly mundane reasons. This is the power of behavioral signaling, because any individual instance of it is explainable. The arrangement of fruit in a window is not suspicious. What makes it meaningful is the framework that surrounds it, the prior agreement, the shared understanding that exists only between the parties involved. To everyone else, it is simply fruit in a window. Timing is one of the most underestimated channels of communication in the world. We tend to think of communication as content, the words, the signals, the objects, the symbols. But timing is its own language, and it can carry extraordinary amounts of information when it is used with precision. In the world of signals intelligence, the timing of a transmission, not its content, not its frequency, but simply when it happens, can itself be the message. An operative might be instructed to make a completely routine telephone call at a specific time only if a certain condition has been met. The call itself might be about anything: a dinner reservation, a reminder about a bill, a question about directions. But the fact that the call happens at precisely 9:47 in the evening, rather than at any other time, tells a handler something specific without a single relevant word being spoken. Extend this to human behavior in daily life, and the implications are striking. The time at which someone arrives somewhere, the time at which they leave, the duration of their presence, all of these carry information to those who know how to read them. An operative who leaves a location 15 minutes earlier than expected might be signaling that conditions have changed. One who arrives deliberately late might be confirming a specific operational state. The clock is a channel. Time is a carrier. Perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated form of hidden communication is the use of silence. In ordinary conversation, silence is what happens when nothing is being said. In intelligence communication, silence can be the most important thing that is said. There is a concept in signals intelligence called the dead drop activation signal, and one of its most elegant forms is the absence of a signal that was expected. Two parties agree that a message will be sent every 72 hours unless something specific has occurred. When the 72 hours pass and no message arrives, the absence itself is the message. Something has changed. The silence is not nothing, it is everything. This principle extends into human conversation as well. A person who normally acknowledges a specific kind of information and suddenly stops acknowledging it is communicating something with that silence. An operative who always sends a brief confirmation of receipt after a meeting and then one day does not is saying something. The silence breaks a pattern, and the broken pattern is the signal. What makes silence so effective as a communication tool is that it requires no action, leaves no trace, and cannot be intercepted because there is nothing to intercept. There is no message to decode, no object to recover, no signal to capture. There is only the absence of what was expected. And the meaning of that absence lives entirely in the minds of those who are expecting something to be there. Let us talk for a moment about the structure of language itself as a vehicle for hidden content. This goes beyond code words and agreed references. This is about using the grammatical and structural properties of communication to carry a second layer of meaning. One of the most elegant techniques in this area is what intelligence historians have called the acrostic method, using the first letter of each word or sentence to spell out a secondary message. In its simplest form, it looks like this: a letter whose sentences each begin with a specific letter, forming a word or phrase when read vertically. But the sophistication of this approach can be taken much further. It can be applied to the first word of each paragraph. It can be applied to every third word, can be applied to the last word of every sentence. The pattern can be agreed upon in advance and varied to make detection even more difficult. What makes structural encoding powerful is that it requires the entire surface message to be crafted with extraordinary care. Every word, every sentence, every paragraph must serve two purposes simultaneously: the visible narrative and the hidden one. This demands a level of craft and intelligence that most people never appreciate when they look at a seemingly simple letter or document. The surface appears natural, but its construction is anything but. Let us go deeper into human psychology, because hidden communication is ultimately not a technical problem. It is a perceptual and psychological one. The question is never just how do we encode the message. The question is always how do we make sure the observer's mind does not register. Cognitive psychologists have a concept called change blindness, the human tendency to fail to notice changes when attention is focused elsewhere. This is not a flaw in perception. It is an adaptation. The brain cannot process everything, must prioritize. It prioritizes based on what appears to be a threat or a novelty. What appears completely normal gets filtered out. Intelligence operatives who understand this principle work very hard to establish normalcy first. They embed themselves in a routine, a behavior pattern, and they maintain that pattern with discipline for weeks, months, sometimes years. They become part of the wallpaper of their environment. And once they are part of the wallpaper, their actions disappear into the background. The signal is hidden inside the normal, and the normal is invisible. This brings us to one of the most important concepts in operational security: the importance of the baseline. Before you can hide something inside normal behavior, you have to define what normal behavior looks like. And then you have to live inside it completely and consistently, until it becomes genuinely indistinguishable from who you are. There is a story that has circulated in intelligence training circles for decades, likely apocryphal but instructive nonetheless. A deep cover operative had been embedded in a target organization for nearly 2 years. His cover was solid. His behavior was consistent. His relationships within the organization were natural and well established. Then one day, for a reason his superiors never fully understood, he made a small but catastrophic error. When a counterintelligence officer asked him a routine question about his background, he answered a fraction of a second too quickly. Not incorrectly, not suspiciously incontent, simply too quickly. As if the answer was rehearsed rather than recalled. That small deviation from the expected pace of natural recollection was enough to flag the conversation for a second look. Within a week, his cover was broken. The lesson is brutal in its precision. It was not the lie that was detected. It was the difference between how a lie sounds and how the truth sounds when spoken by someone living inside a lie. The truth sounds slightly different, more natural, less prepared. And the counterintelligence officer heard it in less than 1 second. Pattern recognition is the fundamental skill on both sides of hidden communication. The person sending hidden messages is trying to construct patterns that are invisible. The person trying to detect hidden messages is trying to find patterns that should not exist. Both are engaged in an extraordinarily sophisticated cognitive exercise, and the winner is almost always the one with more data. This is why experienced intelligence officers collect enormous amounts of seemingly trivial information about their subjects. Not because any single piece is significant, but because the aggregation of observations eventually reveals the shape of the pattern. The person who takes the same route to work every day is not suspicious. But the person who takes the same route, except on the days when a specific external event occurs. That is a pattern worth examining. The deviation tells you that the choice of route is not random, and non-random choices always mean something. There is a subset of hidden communication that operates through what people choose not to do. This is the language of deliberate omission. In ordinary social interaction, there are norms of behavior that operate almost automatically. When two people know each other, they greet each other. When someone receives a message, they acknowledge it. When something significant happens in a shared context, people who are aware of it discuss it. When someone consistently violates these norms in specific ways, the violation is informative. An operative who stops making eye contact in a specific social context might be signaling heightened surveillance. A contact who stops mentioning a subject they previously discussed regularly might indicate that the subject is no longer safe. The behavior that is missing tells a story about what the person knows, what they fear, and what they are trying to avoid. This is why good counterintelligence work is not simply reactive. It is deeply observational. It is about building a three-dimensional picture of normal behavior and tracking any deviation with calm. Patient attention. Attention because the deviation might be nothing, but it might be everything. Let us talk about what happens in environments where surveillance is total, where conversations and movements are tracked. In these environments, conventional communication becomes difficult, and yet communication still happens. The human need to transmit information cannot be suppressed indefinitely. What changes is the medium. People developed communication systems that operated entirely within the visual field of their captors. A way of folding a napkin, a method of placing a book on a shelf, the angle at which a coat was hung. These were simple, agreed-upon signals that required nothing more than a trained pair of eyes to read. In Lubyanka prison, prisoners in communal vehicles developed a system of tapping on the metal seats. Not in Morse code, but in an alternative system of their own invention developed in the brief time they had together. By the time the vehicle arrived, information about conditions and confessions had been transmitted through an unknown medium. The transport itself had become a covert communications channel. The relationship between signal and noise is the technical backbone of all hidden communication. In any environment, there is an enormous amount of activity, conversations, movements. All of this is noise. The hidden message is a signal buried inside that noise. The goal of anyone creating hidden communication is to make their signal indistinguishable from the noise surrounding it. The goal of anyone trying to detect it is to filter the noise until the signal becomes visible. This is deeply asymmetric because the person creating the signal knows exactly where it is. The person looking for it does not. They are not looking for a needle in a haystack. They are placing a specific piece of straw in the haystack, trusting that to anyone looking in, it appears to be exactly what it is. The most effective hidden signals are those that are not merely ordinary looking, but actively boring. A good signal does not just avoid standing out. It actively generates the feeling of having nothing to offer. It triggers in the observer the unconscious response, "Nothing to see here." This is a more sophisticated goal than simply appearing normal. It requires the communicator to deeply understand what an observer will find uninteresting, and then to engineer their signal to look exactly like that. Now I want to address a dimension of this subject that is rarely discussed, because it involves the use of technology, not as a tool of surveillance, but as a medium of concealment. The digital world has created new and extraordinarily powerful channels for hidden communication. The principles underlying them are exactly the same as those of the physical world. Hide the signal inside the noise, exploit the observer's cognitive limitations, and use context to carry meaning that content alone does not contain. Digital steganography, the hiding of information inside image files, audio files, or other digital media, is a modern extension of the ancient principle. An image sent through a public channel might appear to be a photograph of a landscape, but encoded within the least significant bits of that image's data could be an entire document, a set of coordinates, or a body of text. It would never trigger any content-based filter because it is invisible to content analysis. The image looks like an image. The filter scans it, finds an image, and moves on. The message travels hidden inside a medium that declares itself to be harmless. What this tells us is that the technology changes, but the principle does not. The principle is always the same. Find a medium that the observer will not interrogate because it appears to be what it says it is, and then use that medium to carry something that it is not. Let us now turn to the human dimension more fully. Because all of this ultimately comes down to people, to the cognitive and emotional realities of human beings operating under pressure. Hidden communication is not just a technical challenge, it is a psychological one. The most dangerous point in any hidden communication system is not the transmission. It is the human being doing the transmitting. People are not machines. They feel fear. They feel loneliness. They feel the pressure of carrying information that cannot be shared, of living inside a behavior that is not entirely their own. And these pressures manifest in behavior. A person who is stressed communicates stress even when they are trying not to. The voice changes. The body language shifts. The body language shifts. The choices become slightly less consistent. And all of these changes create deviations from the behavioral baseline that a trained observer can detect. This is why the selection and training of intelligence operatives places such enormous emphasis on emotional regulation. Not the suppression of emotion, which is both impossible and counterproductive, but the management of emotion. The ability to feel what you feel without letting it change how you appear. To carry the full weight of a covert operation without letting any of that weight be visible in the way you walk into a room, shake a hand, or order a meal. The gap between interior state and exterior presentation must be maintained with constant, disciplined effort. The moment that gap closes, the moment what you feel begins to show in what you do, the concealment begins to fail. There is a particular kind of hidden communication that does not involve secrecy at all, at least not in the conventional sense. It involves communication that happens openly, in full view of everyone present. But that is comprehensible only to a subset of those present. This is what sociologists call in-group signaling, and it is far more widespread in daily life than most people realize. Every professional community develops its own vocabulary of reference, phrases, gestures, shared experiences. Lawyers, doctors, military personnel, academics, musicians, All of these communities have developed communication systems. To an outsider, these references sound like small talk. To an insider, they carry significant meaning. Intelligence operatives exploit this human tendency deliberately and systematically. By adopting the professional identity and vocabulary of a specific community, they gain access to its communication infrastructure. They can communicate within that infrastructure in ways that are completely natural to anyone else in the community. Here is another story, this one closer to documented reality. In the early years of the Cold War, a network of couriers operating in Western Europe used a system so simple it was its own protection. Each courier carried a specific type of luggage, an ordinary leather briefcase of a common commercial brand. The information was not in the briefcase, it was in the condition of the briefcase. Clean, unscratched briefcase meant the message had not been compromised. A specific scratch on the left corner of the handle meant the message had been read. A piece of leather tape over one of the hinges meant abort immediately. The simplicity was the security. There was no cipher to break because there was no cipher. It does not look like communication at all. Let us come back to something fundamental: the difference between communication and information. Information is the content, the facts, the coordinates. Communication is the act of transmitting that content between parties. Hidden communication is specifically about making the communication look like something that is not communication at all. The best hidden communication systems make the observer feel that there is nothing to investigate because the medium itself is completely normal. One of the most sophisticated elements is controlled revelation, allowing a small amount of harmless information to be discovered. The audience's attention is directed towards something real. And in the moment of that directed attention, the real operation takes place unseen. In the intelligence context, this might mean an operative who maintains a communication channel that counterintelligence is allowed to discover. It is a channel that carries real but law-level information, carefully selected to be accurate enough to be convincing, but not significant enough to cause operational damage. The existence of this channel satisfies the observer's need to find something. Having found it, they are less likely to look further. The decoy channel becomes a form of camouflage for the primary channel that runs beneath it. This is triple-layered thinking: the surface, the expected concealment, and the actual concealment. The most sophisticated hidden communication does not simply hide. It hides its hiding. As we come toward the conclusion of this exploration, I want to tell you about something that happened in a European city in the late 1970s. It illustrates everything we have discussed today in a single incident. A retired engineer who had worked for a defense contractor had been passing technical information to a foreign intelligence service for almost 3 years. His tradecraft was exceptional. He left no electronic trace. He never met his handler directly. He never made a telephone call that could be attributed. His entire communication system consisted of a garden. His house had a small front garden visible from the street. The arrangement of the plants along the front border, which plants were placed forward, which were set back, communicated his status messages. Once a month, a low-level contact who is briefed only that he should walk past a specific house and observe the garden would do exactly that. He noted the arrangement and reported it. The handler, who had never met the engineer and could not be connected to him by any surveillance method available at the time, received the report and extracted the message from the botanical arrangement. The engineer was never caught through his tradecraft. He was caught because of something entirely human, a moment of personal vanity in which he said something to a colleague that was just slightly too knowledgeable about something he should not have known, a deviation from behavioral baseline. A brief, involuntary signal that he had been carrying information he had not declared. Everything else, the garden, the signals, the perfect operational security, was never discovered. The system was flawless, but the human being inside the system was not. And that is, perhaps, the most important thing that hidden communication teaches us about ourselves. We are remarkably sophisticated communicators. We transmit information constantly, through every channel available to us, through our words and our silences, through our timing and our patterns, through our choices and our omissions. Most of this transmission is unconscious. We do not decide to communicate most of what we communicate. We simply do it because communication is not a choice we make. It is what we are. The intelligence world did not invent hidden communication. It systematized something that human beings do naturally and instinctively in every moment of their lives. Every family has a system of signals understood only by members of that family. Every friendship has a private vocabulary that is meaningless to outsiders. Every community has behavioral norms whose violations carry precise social messages. We are all constantly participating in communication systems that are layered, contextual, and invisible to those who do not share the context. What the intelligence world adds is intentionality, the deliberate construction of these systems, the conscious exploitation of human perception's limitations, the engineering of normalcy as a medium. So here's the shift in perception that I promised you at the beginning of this video. So the next time you walk through a crowded public space, an airport, a market, a train station, and you look around at all the people going about their ordinary lives, carrying their ordinary objects, having their ordinary conversations, I want you to consider something. You are looking at a communication environment of extraordinary density. Every person around you is transmitting information on multiple channels simultaneously. Most of it is ordinary, some of it is intimate, and a vanishingly small amount of it in that crowd on that day might be something else entirely. Not because the world is full of spies, though the world has always contained more than most of us realize, but because the principle that makes intelligence communication possible is not a special feature of spycraft. It is a fundamental property of human communication itself. The ordinary world is already a medium. What we call hidden communication is simply the deliberate and disciplined use of a channel that all of us use every day without knowing it. The question is not whether hidden communication exists around you. The question is whether you are paying enough attention to see it. And if you are not, if the surface of things is all that you observe, then you are precisely the kind of observer that every hidden communication system in history has been designed to rely upon. The language has always been there. In the arrangement of objects on a shelf, in the timing of a phone call, in the silence that falls in a specific moment, in the sentence whose first letters spell something that the sentence itself does not say. You simply needed to know what to look for. Disclaimer: this documentary script is produced entirely for educational and informational purposes. The historical references, operational concepts, and tradecraft principles discussed are drawn from publicly available historical and academic sources on intelligence, history, and communication theory. Nothing in this content is intended to facilitate, encourage, or provide operational guidance for any illegal, covert, or harmful activity. All scenarios and stories presented are either historically documented or illustrative composites created to explain documented concepts. Viewer discretion and critical thinking are always encouraged.